So Rama said earlier, there were meetings into the late hours of this morning. We crave your indulgence and again, apologize for the delay in the session, but in 5 minutes, we will proceed. Kindly grab your coffee and we look forward to seeing you shortly.
Greet him as a panelist and then
Our proceedings have officially begun. To the IT team, please play the opening video.
Africa, a continent brimming with opportunities. Following 2 years of global shocks, African economies are defying domestic and global shocks and returning the continent onto a path of economic recovery, stability, and growth. The lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the ravages of climate change, and the impact of rising geopolitical conflicts and tension forced Africa's economies to slow down to 3.8% in 2022. In spite of a challenging global environment, the rays of a brighter 2023 and 2024 are on the horizon. Africa continues to demonstrate extraordinary resilience. African countries maintained a positive growth in 2022 and present a stable outlook for the next 2 years. To remain on this trajectory, Africa's economies will require comprehensive information and insights to navigate a labyrinth of intertwined global risks. This is why the African Development Bank Group published the inaugural 2023 Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report. This publication offers policymakers, global investors, researchers, and other development partners up-to-date, evidence-based assessments of the continent's recent macroeconomic performance. It also provides a short to medium-term outlook amid dynamic global economic developments. The report will be released in the first and third quarters of each year and complement the bank's flagship annual African Economic Outlook Report. This first edition of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report urges bold policy actions at national, regional, and global levels to help African economies mitigate current and anticipated risks. The African Development Bank Group and its team of experts are working to ensure regional and global access to up-to-date, authentic, and reliable information, analysis, and forecasts about the continent's economic performance and prospects.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special side event, the presentation of the African Development Bank Group's 2023 Africa Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report on the margins of the 36th Annual Summit of the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. My name is Victor Oladokun, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator today. This will be a hybrid event, or is a hybrid event, with a live audience here in Addis and an online audience from across Africa and other parts of the world. Once again, welcome. We'll be joined today by several regional and global leaders who will share their thoughts on Africa's economic prospects in the year ahead. Now, a key feature of our time together this morning will also be a very robust panel discussion that will provide key takeaways from the African Development Bank's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report. And our panelists will be looking into the proverbial crystal ball to give us a sense of what lies ahead for Africa over the next 10.5 months. Once again, my name is Victor Ladukun, and it really is an honor to moderate this critically important session here at the AU headquarters. To provide welcome remarks and to help kickstart the presentation of the Macroeconomic Performance Outlook Report, we have the honor of having with us one of the continent's most distinguished statesmen. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, who is ably represented this morning by His Excellency Ambassador Muchanga Albert, the Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals. As you can tell, he has a huge portfolio here at the African Union Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly give Ambassador Muchanga Albert a warm round of applause.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. I'll begin my statement with a relatively long salutation. So it's a process of protocol. Be patient with me. And in the salutation, I'll begin by recognizing His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, President of the Republic of Zambia, represented by the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Zambia, Dr. Stombeko Musokotwani, who is also a member of Parliament. I also recognize the President of the African Development Bank, Dr. Adesina, and I recognize several honor ministers in this audience, and they are also members of the diplomatic corps and members of international organizations who are working in the Federal Republic of Zambia. And we also have Dr. Sidi Oditam, the Director General of Badia, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, economist and director at the Center for Sustainable Development of Columbia University in the United States of America. And we also have executive directors of the African Development Group. And also there were the senior management team and staff of the African Development Bank, and as well as African Union Commission. And of course, we have the other participants, but panelists, or just people wanting to contribute by observing what is going on. And we have the people who ensure that whatever we do goes down to the public, and these are the members of the press. And of course, the last but not the least salutation is ladies and gentlemen. My role is to welcome each and every one of you to the headquarters of the African Union. And for all those from Africa, this is your headquarters. It's not just for the heads of state and government and the staff working in the commission, it's all the ordinary Africans. And in so doing, the first point I would like to make is that this event is possible because a lot of effort was made to bring it to where it is. It was not easy. The first step was to produce the document that we are presenting. And the second step was to make logistical arrangements for this meeting today. So I know that my brother, Professor Orama, and his team worked tirelessly, and they slept very little hours. And I also slept very little hours this morning because the Executive Council ended quite late. Now, the effort that is being made to come up with this publication has both positive and negative responses. I'll begin with the negative. I know that within the African Development Bank, I know that within Africa, there are some elements we are going to say is wasted effort. If I come up with another document when there are several other publications of a similar nature in other multilateral financial institutions across the world. And my advice is that we should ignore those critics, people with that view, with the contempt they deserve. And that brings me to the positive side. The general refrain is that knowledge is power. Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook report, which is going to be produced biannually, is going to develop a board of knowledge. A lot of effort is going to be made to have very, very deep insight on what is going on in Africa in the macroeconomic sphere. So it's a process of self-empowerment where we're able to identify challenges and opportunities and then commit to exploiting those opportunities for the good of our continent. And a lot of people are going to benefit from this report series. Starting with the executive directors of the African Development Bank Group, the staff within the African Development, the general public, heads of state and government, ministers of finance and national planning. If all of them take the time to read this document, study it, review it, and generate insights from what they've read, they'll be better placed to make policy decisions. And the Africans, ordinary Africans, will be better placed to understand what is going on around the continent and the efforts of the African Development Bank Group to bring us to where it is. I'm not going to go into the contents of the document. All I can say is that it's very, very important that you give it the visibility that it deserves. The meeting here this morning is part of that process. And as African Union Commission, we are ready at all times to contribute in giving visibility to this document. During the course of the year, we've got the Media Coordination Summit. A presentation can be made during that time if the second edition is ready. And like I indicated to my brother, Professor Orama, when the president of the African Development Bank Group addresses the assembly tomorrow, you should have come with the adequate copies of the publication. It would be desirable if you put it on the tables of the heads of state and government so that they can go and make use of that document. And to those colleagues who are in this meeting and in the virtual sphere, the soft copy is available on the website of the African Development Bank, so make use of it. So once again, each and every one of you, you're most welcome to the African Union headquarters. And I know that we're also punishing our colleagues who are on the western side of the globe, because it's just about 9 hours here. So it must be very early in the morning on the other side. But your presence reflects the commitment to contribute to what we are doing this morning. So I'll end here and reaffirm my warm welcome to each and every one of you. The chairperson of the African Union Commission, Dr. Musokotwani Mohammed, should have been here. Like I indicated, this is a very, very busy period, so many engagements. And for me today, I've got 2 events. And some of them, my colleagues are there, they have to decide how I'm going to handle them because they begin at the same time. Maybe they'll cut me in half. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Muchanga Albert, for delivering welcome remarks on behalf of His Excellency Musokotwani Mohammed, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Now, joining us virtually, bright and early, and to provide our first brief opening keynote is a leader who needs no introduction. He lives and he breathes Africa every single day. And it's not for nothing that he is described affectionately quite often as Africa's optimist in chief. And that's not to say that he is not a realist. He acknowledges Africa's challenges and he consistently comes up with innovative solutions by connecting trends and challenges with creative outcomes. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this morning, can I give a warm welcome to the President of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Adesina, as he gets ready to deliver his keynote remarks.
Oh, thank you very much, Victor, and I hope that you can hear me. Your Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. Your Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, President of the Republic of Zambia, represented by the Minister of Finance. His Excellency, my dear brother, Musokotwani Mohammed, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, ably represented by His Excellency Albert Muchanga, the AU Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals. And I know you say you have several functions and we have to cut you in half. Please, we want you in whole one piece. But you're doing a great job, Commissioner. Thank you very much for your great support. Honorable ministers present, members of the diplomatic corps and international organizations accredited to the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, my dear brother, Dr. Sidi Udtar, the Director General of Badia, my dear friend, very dear friend, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, globally renowned economist and the Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, who I understand is there actually with his dear wife, Executive Directors of the African Development Bank Group, Senior Management and Staff of the African Development Bank Group, distinguished guests, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to welcome you to the presentation of the first edition of the African Development Bank's report on Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook for 2023. I am deeply honored by the invitation from African Union's Commission's Chairperson, Musokotwani Mohammed, to share the key insights and findings from this publication with you. Firstly, kindly accept my heartfelt regrets for my inability to be there physically with you at this time as previously planned for this event. As you can see, I am not in my traditional and standard bow tie. My dearly beloved mother was buried just on Saturday, so I'm still with my family. And I will only be able to travel to Addis to join you all tomorrow. And definitely, I will be in my bow tie by then. I wish to thank you all for attending this special event. The African Development Bank officially released this important report on the 19th of January at our headquarters in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. I am very pleased to present today the first edition of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook 2023 report, right here in the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. I am pleased to inform you that the African Development Bank Group is the first institution to release the macroeconomic outlook for Africa this year, and I must say that's the first time ever in its history. I commend the bank's Economic Governance and Knowledge Management Complex Vice Presidency, led by Professor Rama, for the continued efforts to provide sound and evidence-based economic intelligence to inform the much-needed structural transformation across African economies as the world grapples with multiple and overlapping economic headwinds. Dear friends, our estimates show that Africa's average real GDP growth slowed to 3.8% in 2022. The slowdown reflects the impact of downside factors, including spillovers from rising global geopolitical tensions, climate change risks, and of course, the lingering impacts of COVID-19, which have been amplified by tightening of global financial conditions and the associated increase in domestic debt service costs. Now, despite the slowdown, Africa demonstrated continued resilience, with all but one country maintaining positive growth rates in 2022, and with stable outlooks in 2023 and 2024. Africa's GDP growth rate is projected to average about 4% in 2023 and 2024, higher than the world's projected averages of 2.7% and 3.2% respectively. It's worth noting as well that 5 African countries have a projected annual GDP growth rate of more than 5.5%. And that means they could return to the league of the world's top 10 fastest growing economies in 2022, or a performance, in spite of all the challenges globally. The projected stability in medium-term growth largely reflects the benefits of policy support in Africa, the global efforts to mitigate the impacts of exogenous shocks and rising uncertainty, and the stable growth in Asia. And as you know, that's one of Africa's main trading partners. African economies are indeed resilient. Despite the confluence of multiple shocks, growth across 5 African regions was positive in 2022, and the outlook for 2023-2024 is projected to be stable. As in other regions globally, of course, this medium-term outlook for Africa will continue to evolve in line with the developments in the confluence of overlapping shocks currently buffeting global economies. These include the ripple effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which continues to disrupt Africa's and global supply chains, while fueling food and energy-driven inflation. The tightening of global financial conditions and the associated increase in domestic debt service costs. The lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which have reversed Africa's gains in poverty eradication efforts by more than a decade below pre-pandemic levels. And finally, elevated climate risks, which continue to exacerbate fiscal risks for countries. Ladies and gentlemen, global financial conditions are projected to remain restricted in the near term, compounded by increased volatility in global financial markets and persistent disruptions in global supply chains. This could put further pressure on exchange rates and keep debt vulnerabilities and domestic inflation at elevated levels, threatening food and security in most African countries. Already, I must say, 15 million more people were driven into extreme poverty in Africa in 2022 due to higher global energy and food prices, exacerbating the pandemic-induced increase in extreme poverty. A sustained increase in food and energy costs could plunge more people into poverty and threaten the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal on eliminating extreme poverty. This highlights the need for Africa to continue to strive for higher growth rates and more inclusive policies targeted to significantly reduce the burden on the most vulnerable and curb the widening income inequalities brought on by these economic disruptions. And that is why the African Union Commission and the African Development Bank Group commissioned a study on key actions to drive inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. The vision is to design and implement policies and programs that will drive the achievement of average GDP growth rates of 7% to 10% annually for the next 40 years. Now, remember when we launched this report at the African Development Bank in Abidjan, my dear friend, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, actually said that Africa ought to be growing at 10% for many more years if we are going to be able to repeat what has been achieved in Asia. I couldn't agree more with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. This study will be the subject, of course, of your next session, being co-convened by the bank and the African Union Commission, which starts just after this particular event. Dear ladies and gentlemen, overall, the global economy will continue to face enormous challenges in the near term. These will include rising food and energy prices, strong inflationary pressures, high debt vulnerabilities, and default risks, growth deceleration, and volatility in global financial markets. There is a need to strongly and collectively support Africa to navigate these challenges, especially on reducing debt burdens and debt vulnerabilities. Africa cannot run up the steep hill of much needed growth while carrying a pack of debt on its back. The rechanneling of the additional 100 billion special drawing rights to Africa will make a huge difference. And the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank are working very closely with the International Monetary Fund to try and see how this can be done. And I want to really thank the IMF staff and, of course, my dear sister, Kristalina Georgieva, for all of the engagement on this. And I believe that we will make a lot of progress down the line very soon. Because the African Development Bank, if we receive the rechannel SDRs, we can leverage these SDRs by 3 to 4 times. This, without any doubt, will make a huge difference. The African Development Bank is also working hard with others around the world to make sure that we optimize the global financial architecture while leveraging more resources to tackle the huge needs of climate change, infrastructure, energy, food, and health challenges, while, of course, attracting the private sector to invest at scale. We must all join hands to harness the enormous development opportunities all across Africa. There is no doubt in my mind that we can make even faster progress. Some recent developments in 2022 give renewed hope. Last year, the Africa Investment Forum, organized by the African Development Bank and its partners, successfully secured over $63 billion of investment interest to Africa. It was incredible. The Tokyo International Conference on Africa, TICAD 8, held in Africa, committed $30 billion to Africa. President Biden and African heads of state got together for the US-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C., which secured $15 billion of investments to Africa. That was also quite incredible. And ladies and gentlemen, at the Feed Africa Summit held in Dakar, Senegal, by the African Development Bank, under the chairmanship of President Macky Sall, the chairperson of the African Union, mobilized $33.5 billion in financing from development partners from around the world in support of bold actions for Africa to feed itself and to fully unlock its agricultural potential, trade with the rest of the world, and boost jobs across its rural economies. Ladies and gentlemen, let us continue to join hands together, foster strong partnerships, leverage the private sector, and fully optimize the global financial architecture to deliver greater financing in support of Africa. That is the quickest way for us to achieve the Africa we want. And I'm quite confident that we'll be able to do that in the near future. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a very good session.
Many, many thanks, Dr. Adesina, for setting the stage with a very apt synopsis and analysis of the 2023 Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report, and doing so with surgical precision as usual. Thank you for joining us this morning. Our second opening keynote will be provided by a leader who has successfully straddled the worlds of business and of public service. He has literally taken his country by storm since taking office as president in 2021. He continues to push the boundaries of what's possible in and for Zambia, and as well as for Africa. Kindly give a warm welcome to the representative of His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, the President of Zambia, Dr. Situmbeko Musokotwani, the Minister of Finance and National Planning. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Let me start off by recognizing the presence of all the distinguished guests, starting from the President of the African Development Bank, Dr. Adesina, who just spoke to us, and the representative of the African Commission, and all the other important guests that are gathered here today, physically here with us, and those who may be watching us remotely. I'm here to read a statement by the President of the Republic of Zambia, who is not yet here, and it goes as follows. It is with great pleasure that I stand before you today for the launch of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report of 2023. This maiden edition of the report represents a significant milestone in the quest for evidence-based knowledge to inform policymaking for more prosperous and sustainable future for Africa. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to His Excellency, Dr. Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, for the invitation to speak at this event. I also want to thank all the distinguished guests, including fellow heads of states and government, ministers, ambassadors accredited to the African Union. I also want to thank His Excellency, Musa Faki Mohammed, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, for hosting us today. As we gather here today, our continent faces unprecedented economic and social challenges, including the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tensions, tightening financial conditions, and climate risks. The African Development Bank's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report provides sound and evidence-based economic intelligence that will inform the much-needed structural transformation across African economies. It is, therefore, fitting that we take time today to reflect on the key findings of this report. It is a comprehensive report that provides an overview of the economic trends, challenges, and opportunities that Africa faces in this highly fluid environment. It identifies key drivers of economic growth and offers policy recommendations to accelerate our progress towards a much more prosperous future. I am pleased to note that the report does not shy away from projecting Africa's economic resilience amidst several shocks. It recognizes the challenges we need to confront. Despite the challenges we face, our economies are growing at a faster rate than many other regions in the world. Africa's GDP is projected to grow by 4% in 2023 and by 3.9% in 2024. This growth will be driven by several factors, including rising commodity prices, increasing foreign investments, and a growing middle class. Of course, we have to take note of the fact that these growth rates, though positive and fairly good, when compared against the population growth rate, gives us not a very high change or high growth on per capita basis. However, we must also acknowledge the challenges that lie ahead and resolve to face them collectively and as individual countries. Africa's economic growth remains vulnerable to external shocks, and we must therefore address the structural constraints that limit our economic potential, such as poor infrastructure, inadequate access to finance, and weak governance. Ladies and gentlemen, as we endeavored to recover from the scars of the COVID-19 epidemic and sustain economic recovery, Russia's invasion of Ukraine inflicted another devastating blow, undermining the most of our efforts and economic gains. Due to the resulting increases in global energy and food prices in 2022, an estimated 15 million more Africans fell into extreme poverty. Inflation is at an all-time high. Per capita income growth is estimated to have slowed in 2022, and the public debt is still higher than it was before the pandemic. Over the past few years, the global economy has experienced a significant shift in monetary policy, resulting in tighter financial conditions that have had a profound effect on developing countries, including those in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, where does Zambia fit in this scenario that I've just described? Zambia has not been spared from these shocks. However, the economy has shown resilience, given that we are coming from a negative 2.8% contraction in 2020. GDP growth is expected to continue on a positive trajectory, although at a slower rate of 3.1% in 2022 from 4.6% in 2021. On the inflation front, a lot of progress has been made. Inflation is now at less than 10% per annum from 22.1% in 2021. And of course, we remain committed to getting to inflation rates within the range of 6 to 8% per annum. Mr. Chairman, a number of economic reforms have been undertaken. These include paying more attention to social sector investments, because as we have seen in the Asian countries, investment in human capital is the most important thing that we need to do. High quality capital is actually more than natural resources. As a result of that, we spent lavishly, or we increased our expenditure last year, recruiting more than 45,000 health workers and teachers to improve health delivery and to roll out the free education policy to keep our children in school. And the result has been overwhelming because now classrooms are full. They were empty before, giving the impression everything was okay. But in actual fact, we're leaving so many people behind. As these reforms took on, it became evident that more needs to be done on the social sectors because classroom space was running out, desks were running out, and so many other things. So as a result of that, the government decided to decentralize very strongly money going to rural areas. So as a result of that, each constituency in the country now receives directly from the Treasury more than $1 million, about $1.5 million, for them to choose on the priorities that they think are important, so that those rural communities themselves, they can decide where they need to build a school, they can decide where they need to build a clinic, they can decide where to put a borehole, and this is working very well. Mr. Chairman, I also want to state that in spite of the global challenges that we face, the Zambian government recognizes that it has certain responsibilities to respond to these challenges and not just wave arms in the air. We recognize the fact that the challenges brought about by climate change, the challenges brought about by the war in Eastern Europe, those are actually opportunities for countries like ours and yours to be able to make good out of them. We believe in Zambia that given the land resources that we have in abundance, given the water resources, our task now is to attract more and more FDI investments in the country to work together with us so that we can produce food in large quantities for exports within Africa and outside Africa. So we believe that in that process, the crisis provides an opportunity for which we can provide an answer. So right now, we are aggressively looking for capital to come and provide, to come and work with us to grow wheat, to grow maize, to grow fruits, anything. And we are making the environment, business environment, to be as friendly as possible so that capital can also be assured that they can make the profits that are necessary for them to make. We also see the drive towards the green economy as something that we can positively contribute to, because as we drive towards the green economy, a lot of copper will be required. And Zambia, together with the neighboring countries, we have enormous amounts of copper. So as a result of that, and of course, we've been told that there will be copper shortages in the next decade, as more of it is required in industry. So as a result of that, we've again made a number of incentives that become attractive for global mining companies to come and work with us to mine copper. Presently, we produce less than 1 million tons, more or less the same quantity that we used to produce together with Chile in the 1970s. Chile accelerated ahead of us. Now they produce about 5 million tons. We're still less than 1 million. So now we've said, in the next 10 years, we must at least get to 3 million tons. And I think that this is something that we African countries must take note of very seriously, because you recall that in the 60s, we were the major producers of a lot of materials, cotton, coffee, palm oil, and many others. But over the decades, we allowed ourselves to be overtaken by other regions of the world. So coffee is no longer massively produced in Africa. The Brazilians have taken over, the Vietnamese have taken over. We believe that it's time for us to be competitive and get to these things. My last point is that for all these reforms that we're making, our biggest enemy is the debt situation. Zambia is heavily indebted. I think that story is well known. When this government came into office, we sought to find which solution was available. Global indebtedness means you must work with other people. It's not like a bilateral situation. So we found a common framework which says if you did A, B, C, D, then debt relief will be provided. Our government quickly embraced what the common framework required us to do. And as I speak right now, we are well on track, having delivered what was required of us to be able to access debt relief. Unfortunately, the common framework itself is proved to be rather slow. And all we can do once again is to urge that the process move faster. Because with all these reforms that we're undertaking, if the debt burden was to be removed, I believe that the attraction of the investment that we're talking about would come much faster and begin to grow an economy that is strong and provides for its people. Mr. Chairman, with that concluding remarks, I want to thank you for according the President of Zambia the opportunity, through me, the Minister of Finance, to make these remarks. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, President Hichilema, ably represented by Dr. Situmbeko Musokotwani. Thank you for an insightful opening keynote and for highlighting Zambia's robust bounce back and economic resilience, as is the case with many African countries in a post-COVID world. You've highlighted for us the imperative of growth-oriented economic policy reforms, the decentralization of development initiatives at a constituency level to the tune of $1 million in each constituency, the economic opportunities a competitive Zambia presents in copper, precious stones, solid minerals, and the efforts being made through a common framework to overcome Zambia's debt crisis in order to attract increased investment and position Zambia for increased prosperity. Thank you very much again for those very insightful remarks. Thank you. Following the opening keynotes by President Hakainde Hichilema and Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, I will now call on the acting chief economist and vice president of the African Development Bank, Professor Kevin Chika Urama, who along with his team have worked relentlessly hard, done a fantastic job to produce this excellent macroeconomic report. Please welcome Professor Urama as he presents key findings from the 2023 Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report. Please give him a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I think I need IT assistance here. I've been logged off the Zoom so that those online can be able to see and hear what we're saying. IT people, please, can you help me? Apologies for the technical glitch.
May I suggest that we proceed and have the team catch up with you? Professor Rama, kindly proceed.
Okay. His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, President of the Republic of Zambia, represented by Dr. Situmbeko Musokotwani, the Minister for Finance and National Planning, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, represented by His Excellency Albert Muchanga, the Commissioner in the African Union Commission, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, Honorable Ministers, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and heads of international organizations accredited to the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Dr. Sidi Tar, Director General for Badea, represented by Fatima El Sheikh, the Strategic Advisor for Badea, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Economist and Director, Center for Sustainable Development, Columbia University, United States of America, Executive Directors of the African Development Bank Group, Senior Management and staff of the African Development Bank Group, here really represented in force, in full force. I want to recognize the presence of Professor Banji Oyoyinka, the Senior Advisor to the President of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Beth Danford, the Vice President for Agriculture and Human Development in the African Development Bank Group, Marilo Akin Olubade, the the Acting Vice President for the Business Development and Delivery Complex of the African Development Bank Group, Professor Vincent Mehiele, the Secretary General of the African Development Bank Group, and Dr. Kevin Kariuki, the Vice President for Energy, Power, and Green Growth and Climate Change in the African Development Bank Group, Ambassador Modibo Ture, Senior Advisor and Senior Envoy to the President of the African Development Bank Group. I also want to recognize the senior leadership of the African Union Commission, with whom we have worked tirelessly to prepare for this event, here ably represented by His Excellency Ambassador Muchanga. I'd like to use this opportunity to just build on the excellent summary of the African Economic Outlook Report, which a Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report 2023, which the President of the African Development Bank Group has already summarized for us. We all know that the global macroeconomic conditions have recently become increasingly uncertain, very dynamic, and persistence of multiple and confounding shocks make policymaking and investment decision-making often very challenging. This dynamic and persistent nature of global shocks and their interactions with prevailing pockets of domestic and regional risks require regular diagnostics and targeted intelligence and policy actions in order to address their impacts and keep Africa in the current trajectory of positive growth that we see. The report shows that Africa still continues to deal with several confounding shocks, which has already been mentioned by the President, the ripple effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has disrupted supply chains, especially in the energy and food markets, the tightening of global financial conditions, especially the appreciation of the United States dollar that has exacerbated currency challenges in the continent, and also the continuing risks of COVID-19 pandemic, which remain a moderate risk for Africa. and has reversed the progress that we've achieved in terms of poverty alleviation before the pandemic. It was because of all these confounding challenges that the African Development Bank Group, under the leadership of President Adesina, decided to release these reports in order to be able to guide global investors, African policymakers, private sector, and African people in making decisions on how to navigate these confounding and dynamic shocks. My presentation will focus on 5 key areas. First, look at Africa's growth, performance, and outlook. Second, the key macroeconomic fundamentals and how it's been changing within these confounding shocks. And then also, more importantly, look at the socioeconomic effects of these changes that we see in the key fundamentals of Africa's economic performance and outlook. Then draw some policy recommendations and some conclusions from the report, homing in a lot more on the key actions that needs to be taken in order to continue to address the shocks that we see globally, including in Africa. On this slide, you see the Africa's performance and outlook. Following an impressive recovery in 2021, after the COVID-19 pandemic, which we reported in the African Economic Outlook Report of 2022, we see that the continent decelerated in terms of growth. The average growth of real gross domestic product, GDP, slowed to 3.8% in 2022. This is falling from what we had in 2021 at 4.8%. And I already mentioned that this has been occasioned by a number of shocks. The growing impacts of climate change that is exacerbating losses and damages and increasing the fiscal challenges for the continent, persistent risks of COVID-19, which we also talked about, and the spillover effects of rising geopolitical, but also regional conflicts. So these 3 factors, COVID, climate, and conflicts, which the president of the African Development Bank Group often calls the 3 Cs, has occasioned significant and substantial volatility in the global financial markets, fueled inflationary pressures, which we heard our honorable minister representing the president of Zambia referred to in his openings, in his remarks as well. It has also disrupted supply chains, especially in the food and energy markets, and softened demand in major export markets of Africa, especially in Europe and China, which are Africa's main trading partners. As in many of the emerging markets, we see that the tightening conditions and appreciation of the US dollar has had their consequences for most Africa's economies. This particular shock or changes that we saw in 2022 has increased the cost of debt servicing and heightened the risk of debt distress across many countries in Africa. It has also restricted access to international capital markets for accessing new financing that is required to address the expanding challenges and fiscal needs of the countries. It has also greatly amplified instability in foreign exchange markets, and I will come back to that when we get to inflation and exchange rate dynamics, but also pushed price stability beyond the grasp of many central banks, both in Africa and across the world. This has exacerbated fiscal positions in Africa, which was already suffering from the challenges, the increased financing needs that was required for addressing climate change and also COVID-19. But the good news here is that Africa's economy remained resilient. Africa's estimated average growth, as the president has already pointed out for us, is far higher than the estimated average growth in 2022, 2023, and 2024 globally. But also more interestingly, it is also higher than the 2.9% that we had in 2029 before the pandemic, and also higher than the 3.3% that we had during 2014 and 2018, which was the end of the commodity super cycles. So one can say that African economies is going back to its health pre-COVID-19 pandemic. But this stable outlook comes with some cautious optimism because we still see continuing challenges in the global markets that I'm going to come back to. But one thing that interested me in this report is seeing that this robust recovery and positive outlook we see is because of continuing policy support we see across African countries. And I think it's good for us to actually applaud our heads of states and government, our finance ministers, central bank governors for doing a great job in bolstering the effects of COVID-19, climate change, and the pass-through effects of the Russia-Ukraine war. In 2019, when COVID was starting, there were lots of prognoses, expectations that Africa's economies is going to be hit the hardest. Africa has proved that prognosis wrong. This is also because of global efforts that we've seen in the mitigation of the impacts of the COVID-19 shocks, and also some of the issues that the president has already referred to, the SDRs of the IMF that helps to bolster the shocks of debt overhang on the continent, and several other external and internal robust policy responses that we saw during the period. But this growth performance and outlook, as usual, is actually heterogeneous across Africa's regions, because Africa is a continent with several countries, different economic structures, and at different stages of growth. We see that in Southern Africa, growth decelerated to about 2.5% in 2022 from the 4.3% we estimated that we saw in 2021. And this is because of higher interest rates, weak domestic demand, and persistent structural issues in South Africa. That's the biggest economy in that region. For West Africa, we saw a growth of 3.6% in 2022 from 4.4% in 2021. Again, reflecting deceleration in the bigger economies in that region, Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria. In North Africa, we see estimated growth of has decelerated by about 1.1 percentage points to 4.3% in 2022 from 5.4% in 2021 due to several factors that you will see when you read the report. East Africa growth was estimated to have moderated to 4.2% in 2022 from 5.1% in 2021. But we expect this to stabilize around 5% in 2023 and 2024. And the impacts of these in Central Africa was a little bit more modest. And we see better, robust, and higher growth in that region due to several policy coordination and stable currencies that we saw in that region, achieving 4.7% in 2022, up from 3.6% in 2021. If you look at the right part of this graph, of this slide, you will see also the decomposition of this growth with regard to the structures of economies, which I have talked about before. We see that resource-rich countries, resource-intensive economies, and major commodity exporters saw the highest deceleration in growth. Tourism-dependent economies had very high recovery because of accumulated savings, household savings in tourism source countries that was accumulated during the COVID-19. And oil exporting economies also declined, even though one would have expected that with the Russia-Ukraine war and the rises in energy prices, that they would be able to recover. And that was because of structural issues in the production and also other issues that with public financial management that in some of those countries. So we see here that generally there is a positive direction for Africa's economies, but still there are challenges, which has been alluded to already by the minister from Zambia. First is exchange rates. We have the tighter financial conditions putting pressure on Africa's domestic currencies, raising the risk of already high inflation getting to the highest that we have seen in the last decade. It destabilized foreign exchange markets in most African countries, But again, the dynamics were mixed from country to country, from region to region, depending on the structures of these economies. Most of the commodity exporting countries lost substantial value to the US dollar in 2022. And the depreciation ranged from 21% in Malawi to 24% in Sierra Leone, 33% in Ghana, 69% in South Sudan. But on the other hand, some currencies appreciated, and that was seen in 29% in Angola, 16% in Seychelles, and 14% in Zambia. While these depreciation rates are projected to slow in 2024, currency weaknesses in Africa's more globally integrated economies, Algeria, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and others, are expected to persist in 2023. So if you look at the report, you find that the drivers of this deceleration and appreciation in currencies varied from country to country. Because of time, I will not go into those details. That will encourage you to read the report. On inflation, we see that average consumer price inflation is estimated to have increased by 0.9 percentage points, rising to 13.8% in 2022 from 12.9% in 2021. And this is the highest inflation rate in more than a decade. Inflation exceeded targets in about 19 countries in Africa, with the highest level seen in Eastern Africa at 25.3%, West Africa 16.8%, and Southern Africa 13.2%. But we also had good stories where in North Africa, we had only 8.1%, below a double-digit inflationary rate, and Central Africa was 7.3%. So we see that also in all these stories, whether it's in inflation or growth rates, we see differences depending on the structures of the economies and the dependence on commodities or other services and so on. And that already begins to show us what kinds of policies we may want to recommend. On average, inflation is projected to gradually ease, declining to 13.5% in 2023, but by 2024, it will be below double digits at 8.8% in 2024. Again, this trend is positive because it's below the 9.2% we had before the pandemic. So Africa's projection is again that it will return to returning to a pre-pandemic economic story. If you look at the fiscal deficits and fiscal balances on the continent, we see again that we have a positive story. Fiscal deficit in Africa narrowed to an average of 4.4% of GDP in 2022 from the 5.2% we had in 2021. This was because of improved revenue performance, especially in oil exporting countries. Again, for the different types of economies, oil exporters, resource-intensive economies, and non-resource-intensive economies, the dynamics were also different. Again, an invitation for you to read the report. In general, fiscal positions are projected to improve in the medium term, supported relatively by revenue performance, as I've already said. An average fiscal deficit is projected to be 4.3% of GDP in 2023 and going down further to 3.9% in 2024. So all these stories, again, continues to show positive trends in Africa's economies, thanks to good policy reforms that we have seen and policy implementations by our leaders over the period. But despite these improvements in revenue gains in 2022, the global economic uncertainties continues to pose significant downside risks to Africa's overall fiscal performance. And this stresses the need for scaling up revenue mobilization, both domestic and external, including the calls that the president has referred to in terms of the SDRs, and also the point that the Honorable Minister from Zambia talked about with regard to addressing the debt issues that we have. On current account balance, we see that current account deficits also narrowed slightly to 1.5% of GDP in 2022 from 1.7% in 2021. Again, varying by the structures of economies that we talked about. The net currency transfers, including remittances and aid, have been positive throughout the period in 2022, rebounding from a decline during the pandemic that we have seen. And this was what has helped alleviate these deficits, the trade deficits and income inflows that we had there during the year. These dynamics are expected to persist in 2023 and also in 2024. However, capital inflows rebounded in 2021 from a fallout that was caused by the COVID. After declining in 2020 due to external financial inflows to Africa, is now estimated to have rebounded by 20% in 2021. This is again because of the renewed interest in supporting Africa by the global partners that we have and other bilateral agencies. So, but the continent still expects to experience portfolio outflows of about $22.5 billion US. The next challenge that remains in Africa is the high sovereign debt that we have seen before the pandemic, exacerbated by the pandemic, slowed a little bit during 2020 and 2021 because of the global support that was received. So now we have a 67% of GDP, debt to GDP ratio in 2022, and this is expected to stabilize around 65% in 2023 and 2024. However, the debt distress remains a challenge on the continent, especially because of the pass-through effects of the COVID, of the Russia-Ukraine war, and also the fiscal tightening that we have seen across during that year. When we try to decompose the debt structure, we see that the current flows in debt dynamics is mainly driven in Africa by exchange rate depreciations and high primary deficits. If you read the report, you will also find that the dynamics varied by economic structures that we have talked about. But here is the most important aspect of the report for me. What are the impacts on citizens? And we find that poorer households have borne the most burden from the current wave of high food and energy prices. And this is because, as you see in this graph, average African households spend about 40.7% of their disposable income on buying food and energy expenditure. 36% of that is on food expenditure alone. So as food prices went up and energy prices went up, it ate much more into their disposable income. The upper 10% of the citizens did not have that similar kinds of impacts. Because of this, per capita income for the poorer households worsened in 2022. And in addition to about 60 million people that were pushed into extreme poverty during the COVID era in 2020 and 2021, we estimate 15 million additional Africans that were pushed into extreme poverty in 2022 because of all these confounding shocks that we have talked about. Now, if we go forward and we see that this pass-through effects is because of the impacts on the energy and food price changes. And this is why the President Adesina has mentioned the Africa Food Summit, where the bank mobilized working with President Macky Sall, the 30 billion to support food compacts in Africa. This is a major recommendation we had from this report. And I want to thank the president of the bank and VP Beth Dunford, and also our leader, His Excellency Macky Sall, for leading that charge, because that will already address one of the major challenges that we haven't seen as we go forward. Another point that was there is undernourishment, which became significant on the continent. Now the moderator is looking at me, so I have to rush to try to conclude. What are the major risks that we see that we need to watch for 2023 and 2024? The first big one is the deceleration in growth across the world, especially in the trading partners. In fact, many countries are expecting to slide into recession, but that is not the story in Africa yet. So these continued global uncertainties and risks are things that countries need to continue to watch. But the risk of debt default could increase in Africa for the reasons that we have talked about, the US dollar appreciation and the fiscal consolidation and tightening of monetary conditions globally. But a third risk that we want to mention is the heightening of the physical risks of climate change, which is increasing the fiscal risks of countries because of the losses and damages that happen. You build infrastructure with borrowed funds, and one event wipes it out. That infrastructure will need to be rebuilt. So we need to pay attention to the climate change impact significantly. But again, high dependence of African economies on primary commodities and exports, we see that countries that depend on this face three kinds of significant challenges: high volatility in incomes and revenues, and also difficulty in estimating what you can have. And because of that, it becomes very difficult to plan. If you try to map Africa's GDP growth rates from 1960 to date, you will see that it tries to trail commodity prices in the global market. So we need to change this as we go forward. But there are also low probability risks, which are moderate. The rates of COVID vaccination in Africa is still low, so we can rule out a resurgence in different countries. We have also regional conflicts in some African countries that we need to watch, because that creates a lot of significant challenges on capital flight and in Africa, but also political risks that could occur from policy reversals. About 30 African countries will be having national elections in 2023 and 2024. So how those elections are conducted and the transition of power will be significant in defining the future of the economy as we look at them. What are the policy recommendations as I try to conclude? One, we need policy coordination. The time is gone when we will think about fiscal policy as standing alone from monetary policy, because some monetary policy actions can have knock-on effects on the productive capacity of countries and access, especially for low and middle-income economies, and also for SMEs in these economies. So there needs to be a very clear coordination in those policies, depending on what are the factors that countries need to look at. We need to boost regional and trade in Africa in the productive sectors. But structural reforms in terms of building tax administration capacity, investing in digitization and e-governance, transparency, reducing illicit financial flows, and scaling domestic revenue mobilization remain key. On illicit financial flows alone, if we are able to curb that, we will increase the GDP of Africa by about 3.7% annually. We are losing over 90 billion annually in that particular illicit flows. So improving institutional governance remain a central part of the policies that we need to think about, and also reducing the structural budget deficits and accumulation of debt in Africa. Debt in itself is not bad, but how we borrow, what we use the borrowed money for are the clear things that we need to think about. And that is why public financial management remain a key aspect of what we need to do. And the African Development Bank is working with the IMF and the World Bank and other partners to actually help countries to be able to do better in those areas. But as we implement these fiscal and monetary policies, we need to remember the most vulnerable people and ensure that policies that cushion those impacts will be very key in terms of how we move forward. The second bucket of policies we looked at is structural industrial policies, strategic industrial policies, that we need to actually try to rethink our models to focus more on the productive sector, manufacturing, and also transforming the energy sector by favoring emergence of gas to power, green hydrogen, and other renewable energy for manufacturing industries. We also need to invest in healthcare, implement local content, and what I would call franchising policies to allow us to add value to our resources. If you think about Zambia and others with huge resources that would drive the green industrial transformation, how we relate with those resources will define how we are going to be able to benefit from that. We also need to continue to invest in regional and hard and soft infrastructure, encourage freer movement of the factors of production between countries in Africa. It might look simple, but the cost of doing business in Africa that's caused by restrictions is a significant aspect that we need to look at. Strengthening the African payment systems is another area, and the Continental Free Trade Area agreement that we have is a huge opportunity that we need to continue to harness. For multilateral development banks, the call that the president has already made is significant. We need to think about how to use our risk capital to catalyze private sector financing for inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. But the global financing architecture itself needs to be looked at, as the president has mentioned already. What are the key takeaways and conclusions? The story of Africa this year was a story of resilience in the midst of global recession. We have positive GDP growth rates in Africa, with 5 countries in Africa now set to return to the best 10 growing economies. We also need cautious optimism, given all the risks that I have mentioned and so on, and bold policies, some of which we have mentioned, in order to move forward. But central to doing this is what Professor Jeffrey Sachs calls investment-led growth. We need to focus on mobilizing resources to be able to drive growth in Africa going forward. Africa remains the place to invest. With 1.4 billion people, access to resources, huge amounts of resources, I'm not going to continue to mention them, to drive growth and development across the world. If I were a private investor, I'll pack my load, jump on the plane, and come to Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rama. I know that there's certainly more that you could deliver, but given the limitations of time, we appreciate the very expansive but synthesized overview that you've provided of a very robust macroeconomic performance and outlook report, one that breaks things down significantly, particularly for non-economics like myself. Thank you for providing a roadmap and for the following insightful conclusions. In spite of heightened risks of global recession, African economies continue to show strong resilience. Despite the confluence of multiple shocks, growth across all African regions and in 53 African countries were positive in 2022, with stable outlook in the medium term. 5 best performing countries in 2022 set to return to the world's top fastest growing economies, and Africa's short to midterm recovery and economic resilience comes with cautious optimism. But most importantly, to meet the significant financing gaps in Africa, it is imperative to enact policies that can mobilize and leverage private financing for infrastructure development in Africa. I hope I've summarized as best as I can your brilliant submission this morning. Now, time really has run away from us, but we do have an exciting panel discussion coming up. So put on your seatbelts because we're going to be going from maybe 60 miles an hour to 120 miles an hour over the next few minutes. We're quite delighted to have with us today during this panel discussion several distinguished leaders. And I'd like to ask that you kindly give them an early morning Addis Ababa welcome, a warm one as we recognize them. Joining us online, she was actually supposed to be here, but there are problems with traffic and a few other logistics, but she is online with us and we're delighted to have her. Her Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, the Federation of the Republic of Nigeria, who again joins us online. Please give her a warm round of applause. And in no particular order, but to my right and your left on screen and in the audience, Dr. Marilaw Akin Olugbade, the Acting Vice President, Regional Development, Integration and Business Delivery. Please give her a warm welcome. Dr. Beth Dunford, Vice President, Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank Group. And to her left, Professor Oyebanji Oyeyinka Oyelaron, the Senior Special Advisor on Industrialization to the President of the African Development Bank Group, as well as Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the Director, Center for Sustainable Development, Columbia University. He joins us here in Addis with his beautiful wife, all the way from New York City this morning. He is a distinguished economist and a passionate development advocate. The New York Times once described him as probably the most important economist in the world. Professor Sachs, it's a joy having you with us this morning. And we also have with us Fatima El Sheikh, the strategic advisor on Badir. Is she in the audience or is she online? Yes. Okay, right. Oh, I do apologize. She's just right next to Professor Sachs. Thank you very much for joining us. And last, but kindly forgive me, that's again a problem of the head and certainly not the heart. Last but certainly not the least will be Professor Kevin Chikaurama, who you just listened to, the acting Vice President and Chief Economist of the African Development Bank Group. So again, we have a fantastic lineup of panelists, and I'm really excited about what it is that they do have to say. I'm going to start off with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. You've been known not to pull punches on numerous occasions, particularly when it concerns Africa. And I just want to ask very quickly here, what are some of your key takeaways from this report? Let's start with you, Professor Sachs.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be together to celebrate this important report. And I want to congratulate the African Development Bank and Kevin Rama, Professor Rama, for his wonderful leadership on this report. I think the key point is that the African economy already shows resilience and moderate growth, and with further steps can become the fast-growing region of the world, and should be, because Africa starts with a lower starting point of per capita income, technology deployment, and so forth. So the room for rapid growth is very, very high. In essence, for me, what China achieved during the 40 years from 1980 to 2020 is what Africa can and will achieve from 2023 to 2063. That means aiming for growth, as President Adesina said, of at least 7 to 10% per year. This is reasonable, it's feasible, and I believe utterly achievable. I think that there are 6 crucial steps from where Africa is today to where Africa can be in this period of robust growth. First, continuing to strengthen the single market in Africa is the single most important step. By the time the imperial age ended in Africa, Africa had been divided into 54 countries. But Africa's the same size population as India and China, each one country with a large market. If Africa replicates the performance of India and China, Africa will achieve the same high results. And it's notable, by the way, that while India lags China in economic growth, it is now in a position of a very rapid period of growth. And so India is showing that the same phenomenon, 1.4 billion people with a unified, sensible economic structure, delivers growth of 7 to 10% per year. Africa surely can do the same. The African Union is the key to this. And this is already well underway with important initiatives in the last few years, and I think more to come. We heard on payment systems, settlements, transboundary infrastructure are all key, but building a single market, Africa will be one of the 3 giant regions of the world, and it will become the largest population in the world, of course, and as a unified place, it will become a center of the global economy very dynamically, in my view. Second is building critical infrastructure, and that means especially power, fiber, rail, roads, and ports. There's a big agenda for infrastructure. It cannot be delayed. It should not be based on what is currently available in national budgets, because that's not enough. It should be financed, and I'm going to come to that. But Africa needs, in the next years, in this decade, to close the infrastructure gaps, which are enormous, but achievable to close, because there's no deep mystery on issues of power or fiber or other basic infrastructure needed for rapid economic development. The third critical area is human skills. That's the major capital stock of any economy. And because of digital technologies now, it is possible, if we really strategize well and deploy well, to have the most rapid upgrading of human skills in history in Africa in the coming 10 or 15 years. Everybody can have access to quality information, to online education, to new kinds of certification and degree training. You could have a continent of universal access to higher education at very low cost, which wasn't imaginable 10 or 20 years ago. And I think that this is incredibly exciting. As a professor now for 43 years, I want to work on that. I said to my university, I'll say an inside story just privately among us, at one point, that it would be possible to deliver online master's degrees in Africa at $1,000 or $2,000 maximum per year. And I was told, well, it doesn't quite fit the business model of my university, but you know what? It fits the business model of Africa. And so this is something that could be a phenomenal breakthrough. People want skills, and all they need is a handheld device right now and some organization from us in the academic side to make a revolution of education faster than ever before, and free or nearly free for people. By the way, yesterday, just as we were in Kenya, in a remote, incredibly impoverished village, just basically nothing, and suffering drought. So it was the bottom, really the bottom. I've seen a lot of villages. This is the bottom. Still, there were phones, there was phone service, and my wife asked, where do you charge your phone? And they showed us the solar panel sitting on the thatched roof that was the phone charger. So it's really possible to reach everybody. Of course, a phone won't do it. They need a $50 device or a $100 device. Then the children there could be getting an education every day rather than the school that is 3 hours walk away from where this village was. This was impoverished, but if you think about it, healthcare, education, payment services, all absolutely achievable on some wireless broadband with a cheap device. And so this is the third point, is a skills revolution, not to wait 20 years or 40 years, but now. And we heard from the Minister of Zambia, keeping kids in school is expensive, but there is no higher return investment in society than that. So we have to solve that problem. Fourth, critical sectors. Clearly, the African economies have several key critical sectors for investment. I would say agriculture is absolutely clearly one. And as President Adesina always emphasizes, without question, Africa could feed itself as a continent and feed a lot of the rest of the world as well. But it requires investment, especially in water, because Africa's 95% rain-fed still. And Africa irrigation changes everything, but it's expensive. So there's a financing issue, but it's a financing issue that is necessary. Critical minerals is the second area where we know that this continent has the minerals needed for global sustainable development. And yet they're basically ripped off until today by outside forces. And this is where smart management, proper taxation, proper guidance to collect the returns on these minerals is essential. It's a tragedy. I know it firsthand. Countries are getting ripped off by the Swiss, by the Chinese, by the Americans, by everybody for critical minerals like cobalt that are central for the world economy, happen to be in Africa, but not to be plundered. And Pope Francis said it very well when he was in the DRC last week. First, let Africa breathe. And second, Africa's not here for your taking and plunder. And so this is a really basic point, is the critical sectors. The fifth area that I believe is key to all of this is finance. Because basically, the most fundamental problem in the international system is that the poor pay usurious rates and the rich are able to finance nearly for free. And so if you look at what Europe or the United States pays for a 30-year sovereign bond, maybe 3% interest. Try that for an African country right now. Ghana, for example, which is in debt distress, 13%, 15%. Or, sorry, you don't qualify for any funding. We don't even roll over existing debts. This finance question is completely based on false economic premises. The rating agency systems are, in my view, absolutely wrong and self-fulfilling in what they do. The IMF, World Bank debt sustainability analysis is terrible. And it's a shame for me because many of them are my students and they didn't learn what they did in my class. Because in my class, I taught how investment has a high return, much higher than the cost of capital. And so you borrow to finance your infrastructure. You don't sit without electricity. You electrify based on finance. But the IMF has a different idea. We don't want you to bother us. We don't want you to get into trouble. So sit without electricity. This is not right. So this finance question is central. And I can tell you, it can be won intellectually without question. I know it because, first of all, they do it wrong. The rating agency team said to me, Mr. Sachs, we don't know anything about development economics. We just make predictions about default events in 3 months or 6 months. I say, yes, but you cause many of them. You downgrade a country, then it can't roll over its credits, then it defaults. It says, yes, but our problem is we forecast. But the IMF should know better. The IMF should have a debt sustainability analysis based on long-term growth. Africa is not overly indebted. Africa is under indebted. Why? Because no one lends to Africa. Why not? Well, because the IMF says, don't take on any loans. Or if you reach 30% of GDP, that's too dangerous, or 50% of GDP, that's too dangerous. This is completely wrong. Completely analytically wrong. I'd much rather be at 200% of GDP debt with electricity, fiber, and all the kids in school. Because then the growth is going to be 10% per year for a generation. When you grow at 10% per year, you are doubling every 7 years. And you do that even for 21 years, that's an 8-fold increase in the size of the economy. And what looks like unpayable debt is not any problem at all. But the financing has to be long-term. Don't borrow for 3 years for a 40-year development project, because that's guaranteed to lead to crisis. We need Africa to be financed on a large scale for long-term at the same terms as the rich countries, period. And I believe we're going to get there.
And on that note,
just if I could just finish two final thoughts. I'm sorry to go on, but two final quick thoughts. First, the African Development Bank is the key institution for making this breakthrough. Currently, the AFDB finances, as I understand it, around 12 billion a year. It should be about 100 billion a year. I want to put that on the table, because that will be the breakthrough for Africa to be one of the centers of the world economy. At least 100 billion a year lending by this extremely important institution. That's number one. Last point is the African Union absolutely needs to become the 21st member of the G21, because, and not, as I was recently told, as an permanent observer. That's nonsense. Africa's not an observer, it is a protagonist. So we need the African Union at the G21. And I'm on my way to India. I'll be meeting with Indian leadership. They have the presidency this year. They'll get it. This will be a huge diplomatic breakthrough. Thank you very much.
I think we can do a whole lot better than that. We'll kind of give Professor Sachs an even warmer round of applause. Again, Professor Sachs, thank you very much for unpacking quite a bit there. The imperative of a 7 to 10% growth to sustain development on the continent, and the projection and the hope that Africa indeed will become a center of the global economy. And critical to that will be massive financing of infrastructure in power, fiber, and other critical areas. And I love what you said about the need to develop an African business model that makes education accessible, either at little or no cost, or at a minimum $1,000 to $2,000 for a master's degree. What an amazing revolution that indeed will be in terms of upskilling the millions and millions of Africans who lack the opportunity and lack access to better education. Thank you again for your comments about the AFDB being critical to a lot of the initiatives that are taking place on the continent, as well as your active push and active involvement in ensuring that Africa indeed becomes a permanent member of the G21, not as an observer, but as a member. Once again, can I give Professor Sachs a warm round of applause? I'm going to go right now to Her Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed, who is online, and we'd like for you to give us your brief takeaway from the report. Dr. Shamsuna Ahmed, are you still with us? Yes, you are. Okay, can we bring Her Excellency's audio up, please? Thank you. We're going to need audio, please. Your Excellency, just hold on a second for us while we bring your audio up, please. We'll come back to Her Excellency in just a few moments. If the technical team can work out the kinks on that, we're going to go right now to Dr. Beth Dunford. Your takeaway on the report.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oladipo, for inviting me to speak. And I think that there's so much has been said. I want to first just recognize all protocols observed, the leadership from countries and partner institutions. And I think that the important thing that, we took away is said by—
Sorry, while you're on there, please, could we kindly have the technical team let Her Excellency Shamsuna Ahmed know that we'll come to her in a few minutes. I see that she's still online and addressing us without realizing that she is not being taken at this point. If the technical team can be on top of this, not just for Her Excellency, but other speakers who are online, that'd be very much appreciated. Dr. Dunford, back to you again.
Thank you very much. And as we saw in the report, poorer Africans spend about a third of their income on food. And so when you see issues like the global food price crisis come about, this is very, very dramatic for poor people, more and more people falling into poverty. We're seeing 285 million Africans going to bed hungry every night, and this situation is absolutely unacceptable. So the vulnerability of Africans' food supply, the tremendous dependency on imports to meet basic food needs has really been brought into great detail with this crisis in Ukraine. And so I think that the Jakarta Summit, as referenced by President Akinwumi Adesina, was really a moment to come together to say, for political leadership across the continent to really focus on the need to increase investment in agriculture and agricultural transformation. The technologies exist to really transform agriculture on the continent. And with the investment that we see promised and the political leadership and political commitment that we saw at the Dakar Summit, we really believe that it is possible. Again, with over 30 billion of investment from partner, indications of support from partner countries, over 34 heads of state, really that is the investment that need to transform. That's the investments in technologies. Technologies exist to increase yields on the continent, to really plant crops in areas that were heretofore too dry, too marginal, too vulnerable to really see the yields that we'd like to see. There are examples of heat-tolerant wheat, bringing Ethiopia to wheat self-sufficiency in just a matter of a couple of years. Again, it's that type of transformation in very record time that we need to see to really not only bring down the prices of food so poor people can access the food they need when they need it at prices they can afford it, but also to really ensure that governments aren't spending their precious foreign exchange on importing basic staples. So I think that what we've seen is that we've got the platform, the investments, the technologies, the know-how to transform this effort going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dunford, and excellent news post Dakar 2. We've seen an increase from initial commitments of $30 billion to $33.5 billion to date, and still counting, with lots more to come. I'm going to go now to Professor Oyinka Oyelere for your brief takeaway on this report.
Thank you very much. Let me start on existing protocols. I'll make three very quick points. We've mentioned a lot about the categories of countries today, and one of them is the oil-dependent and natural resource-dependent countries. And I want to refer to the enormous amount of work that Jeffrey Sachs and his colleagues did a long time ago on natural resource and their correlation with growth. The conclusion that many came to over and over, and I have a recent book in 2022 came to the same conclusion, is that natural resource dependent countries always stagnates. In fact, since the 70s, in fact, if we go back to the 1950s, you find that all of these countries experience what we call the natural resource cost for so many reasons, which we don't want to go into right now. So the first point I would like to make is that while we identify this category of countries as, suffering from volatility and all the foreign exchange issues, what is the solution? We need to assist them to pivot away from this pathology of dependency on natural resources. I think that's the first point. And this is something I believe we should take upon in the book that is coming up. And again, you find that the title of that book, the bank and AU is championing, includes two words: inclusiveness and sustainability. You cannot build a sustainable economy on simply exporting raw materials. We've done this for 60 years. Africa has remained poor. Africa has been very vulnerable to external shocks. You see all those graphs. In 2020, all of those countries that depend on oil and minerals, they simply just went to negative growth. So I think we need to address this. It also doesn't help with inclusiveness because minerals and oil, they are all what you call enclave economies. They are unlike manufacturing that's spread all over the geographic space of a country. So my second point will be that Africa should go back to the basics. We should be production focused. We started in the 70s by we did a lot of industrial policies. Many countries actually went ahead to acquire technologies. Many of them didn't work, including my own country, where we have several capital-intensive industries, steel, petrochemicals, all of them. They all went down the drain after the structural adjustment program. We need to go back to the basics. Countries that want to develop need to develop their industrial manufacturing capability. What you don't see this day is the analysis of people like Caldor and all of that. You don't see them in World Bank analysis. It shows clearly that the faster the growth of manufacturing output, the faster the growth of your GDP. And that came to the point that Jeff is making. If you want to grow faster, you have to manufacture. If you keep exporting low value and low value raw materials and you are importing sophisticated products, you run into foreign exchange crisis. It's as simple. If your rate of import is far higher than your rate of export, you will not balance your accounts. So it's as simple as that. So, and the third point, and I have one last point, is that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area should not be just a trading area. Dr. Adesina has said it many times. We will succeed to create a zone that is, how did he put it? He said, highly organized, where we are all trading in very poor materials. You give me sorghum, I give you maize, and we remain poor forever. Africa Continental Free Trade Area should be a zone of manufacturing. If you don't organize your economy to be able to export manufactures, others will export it to you, and again, you will run into problems of how do you buy it. And my final point is what Dr. Dunford made just now. Africa, we have repeatedly said, has 65% of all uncultivatable arable land in the world. We need to industrialize agriculture. We need to industrialize our rural areas. The bank is working on a special agro-industrial processing zones. And I believe that this is one thing that I'm very strongly convinced about will revolutionize Africa's rural and in fact also urban areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yinka. Greatly appreciate it. You've encouraged us to move away from enclave economies in oil and other natural resources to a much more distributed and integrated economies, particularly in the manufacturing sector, and reducing our dependence on the export of natural resources and adding value, which again is a no-brainer, as you said. We've been doing this for 60 years, and it's time, certainly, for change. Value addition, value addition, value addition. Africa, we say that repeatedly, is the richest, the most blessed continent in the world. We have stupendous wealth, but that wealth can truly only become wealth indeed for the billions of people on the continent, or the 1.2 billion people, when we add value to what we have. I'm going to go next to His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim, the Associate Minister of Finance for Policies. Actually, no, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, because earlier we had technical hitches with Her Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed from Nigeria. And I gather part of the problem, Your Excellency, is that you do need to unmute your audio. I just saw her go off screen a few moments ago. She's still with us. If you could kindly unmute your audio, that would be much appreciated. We'll be able to hear you. Again, back to Her Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed. Do you have Her Excellency online? Yes, we do. Your Excellency, could you unmute your microphone, please?
Yes, Dr. Victor, thank you again. I hope this connection stays for at least for some time. And I'll be very, very brief and to the point. So all of the issues that have been raised in the report, there's a public crisis, has affected our country as well. And to say that we have steadily steered the country back to the path of growth, our target is to be able to reach the pre-COVID-19 growth levels, but we still face a number of challenges, a lot of which are global, but that affect us locally. We have high food prices, inflation is at very high rate and still climbing up. In our case, the Naira also continues to weaken against the dollar, increasing our debt service obligations. But some of the things I want to mention that I really saw for us is the issue of the cost of financing that we're faced with. When we have to go to the market and we don't have any support, we end up borrowing at very, very high cost compared to European countries that are whose economies are not even as strong as ours, that end up with low cost. We've been asking for a liquidity sustainability facility as part of the use of the SDRs that have been issued and not utilized by countries that don't need them, to act as a cushion for our country so that when we go out to borrow, that the borrowing cost is less. We need this financing to be able to invest in critical infrastructure that is required for us to grow, even to grow industry, to expand fiber optics so that we can skill more people quickly and also provide better quality education for our citizens. So this LST is very important to us. We have also been asking MDBs to consider giving us longer term financing and larger size financing. Most MDBs come with financing that enable us to do pilots. We're tired of pilot projects that take years to roll out. We need scale. At this time, we just need scale. Nigeria has shown a lot of resilience as a country, but also the people have shown a lot of resilience. So, and we just need that breakthrough, that support to enable us to take the full advantage within the continent of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that is that we have set up and we are still struggling to implement properly. We need to grow industry. We need to support micro, small, medium enterprises to be able to attain the 7 to 10% growth that is projected in the report. We're currently growing at average of 3% in our country, with a population of 201 million people, and with the population increase rate almost at the same rate as our GDP growth. So we need scale in financing. We need scale in any support that comes to our country. We also are urging countries that are providing support that to address the high food prices. While it is important to provide grains, what we require, at least in Nigeria, is not for food to be provided to us. We want inputs and technology and machinery to enable us grow enough food to feed our people, to export the food, to add value to the food items. We don't need grains to be delivered into our countries just to feed people alone. That is not enough. We need to be able to grow the food and as well as process it and export this food items across the continent. I want to just add that the issue of the rating agencies is also a very sore one. These rating agencies need to know that their assessments are bringing our countries down and also affecting the lives of the population in our countries. It shouldn't just be a tick box exercise. This assessment should be on a long-term basis. An incident happens, and because of that, a country is downgraded. And your instruments in the international capital markets suffers around. If you go out to raise for financing for developmental projects, you're not able to access the financing, or you access it at a very, very high cost, which makes the returns almost impracticable to achieve. We've done a lot of work in Nigeria. We've moved away from depending on oil revenues. Currently, a greater contribution of government revenues is the non-oil sector. We started in 2015 with oil revenues contributing 70% to our budget. We've moved that to non-oil revenue contributing 73% of our budget. We've done a lot of work. There's a lot of reforms, but there are global incidents. There's a poly crisis that keeps working against the growth that we have been trying to achieve. But despite that, Nigeria remains resilient and will continue to push the bar. We've done a lot to catalyze private sector capital to support us in building out major infrastructure. A quick example that I would like to give is the Road Infrastructure Tax Credit Scheme, which is a unique model that we have put together that enables investors in the private sector to use their funds to develop specific roads in specific economic corridors and recover their investment through tax credits over a period of time. We have also other innovative financing models that encourages both investments directly by the private sector and also indirectly through the domestic capital market to raise financing for infrastructure development in our country. I want to congratulate AFDB for continuously putting together this macroeconomic outlook. It's important that we continue to see what the trend is, and also the recommendations that have been provided are very apt, and we will seek to strengthen our reform efforts using the recommendations of the report. Thank you, Dr. Victor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed, and for steering the ship in Nigeria, a job that you've done creditably well over the last few years. Thank you for highlighting the endemic problem of the high cost of financing, echoing the challenges earlier emphasized by Professor Sachs and Dr. Adesina, who has repeatedly highlighted the need for a revamp of the global financial architecture. Again, the issues of rating agencies who, rather than look at short-term projections, rather long-term projections, tend to focus on the short-term with their attendant implications. And for investors interested in going into Nigeria, innovative finance models such as the road infrastructure tax credit schemes, again, a resilient Nigeria with 200 million people and counting, wishing you all the very best. I'm going to go next to Dr. Marilaw Olugbade for her comments and overviews of this very, very important document, particularly in terms of regional integration and business delivery. Your takeaway here.
Thank you very much, moderator and doctor, maybe not yet. I stand on existing protocols, and I would like to, of course, salute Professor Orama and his team for a report that really provides a very sound and evidence-based economic intelligence to really inform the work that we do and the much needed structural transformation of the continent, even as the continent is still really grappling with multiple and overlapping economic headwinds. This type of reports helps us to basically provide a check on what we are doing. Whether some of the policies, the recommendation, the work that we are doing with countries goes in the right direction. It provides an opportunity for us to correct the trajectory when the needs arises. And here I would like to, of course, and it has been said again, praise the government, the heads of state, the government, the authorities for really the success. They are reaping now the benefit, the rewards from all the sometimes very painful reforms that have been implemented over the years. And we have seen that with a continent that has been resilient, that is still proving resilient despite the cumulative crises, I think deserves really a special commendation. The second point, the second takeaway here is that, and again, on the basis of the previous comment, especially from Professor Jeffrey Sachs, I'm really pleased to note that the bank is really very much going into the right direction. I think Professor Sachs could have maybe even summed up what he said by referring to the high fives of the bank. And this is exactly what we are doing. We are very much focused on infrastructure financing. Over the past 6 years, we have invested more than $45 billion in infrastructure financing. And it is, of course, road, it is energy. Energy is a critical area. And of course, we have VP Kevin Kariuki, who is leading these efforts at the bank. We talked about education. He talked about the challenge. I think it's a challenge to all of us to make sure that we have indeed free education, and it is possible, nearly free education for every child, every young people in Africa. And I think, Beth, this is a challenge, and we will work on it together, because it is also in your portfolio. And I think what we said about the single market and the regional integration, supported by Professor Banji, about the fact that we must be able to trade in higher value goods for this single market to work and to benefit the continent, to give us the jobs that we need. And therefore, we need to be able to really map those value chain and see really where the continent has a comparative advantage. I mean, it's amazing that despite these exogenous shocks, the continent has been able to resist. And it's probably beyond imagination what we could do if indeed the continent could work, could trade, and could truly exchange on that level. So the prospects are huge, and Professor Sachs, I have no doubt that indeed if we can continue, because we have started, if we can continue to put all these acts together with the countries in the lead, with the leadership also of the African Union, indeed, Africa is the continent that will provide the shining light to the rest of the world. It will feed the rest of the world, and it will also provide the resilience that is needed at the world level. Of course, we talked about the financing, and here I would like again to highlight the leadership role that the bank has played in this area. I think the bank is now acknowledged as a leader in financial innovation, in better leveraging its capital. We keep coming up with new innovation, and this is what the continent expects from us. So when Professor Sachs, you said that you see the African Development Bank at the heart of everything that will be done on the continent, I think you are again preaching the right approach, and we certainly are ready to rise up to that challenge. It's important also that Africa's role and voice in global affairs be clearly established. And again, the African Development Bank plays its part in this area. I think we are very, very under the leadership and with the President Adesina in the lead. We know we have a position on the climate, we have a position on agriculture. I've said it on infrastructure, this is what we do. I'd like to mention that immediately after the Dakar summit on food security, we organized also the infrastructure summit to discuss the infrastructure plan, the priority action plan for the financing of infrastructure, $160 billion. And we had an opportunity to review the first phase of the PIDA project. And I'm pleased to indicate that the African Development Bank financed about 30% of this whole first PIDA. So this is what we do, and we will continue to do so. And I'd like to maybe end on this note and indicate that we are optimistic, because when the countries lead and we see that when they make the right policy decision, there are dividends that accrue, and this is encouraging. And we have no doubt that working together with the African Union, with the countries also making a strong advocacy for the leadership role of the African Development Bank, we think that in a not too distant future, we will have a continent that we are all, the continent that we want and that we are very proud of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mary-Laure Akinolugbade. Greatly appreciate it. We did start this session a little bit late. We about 30 minutes, probably a little bit longer behind schedule, but I'd like for us to wrap up within the next 15 minutes. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to come next to Dr. Mohamed Ibrahim, the Associate Minister of Finance for Policies and Economic Affairs of the Arab Republic of Egypt in a moment, and he will be followed by Fatima El Sheikh from Badia, after which we will, I believe we do have one more remark coming from a minister who has just arrived late. I'm waiting for the details. And we will conclude with closing remarks by Dr. Akinwumi Adesina. But before he gives us his closing remarks, again, I just want each of our panelists to prep and prepare a 90-second summation, closing comments, moving forward, an inspirational message for Africa moving forward based on this report. So that's what we'll do over the next 15 minutes or thereabouts. So next, we're going to come to Dr. Mohamed Ibrahim, the Associate Minister of Finance for Policies and Economic Affairs, the Arab Republic of Egypt, who joins us online. And I trust that we've overcome some of the technical hitches that we did have earlier. Thank you very much. We're going to go to Dr. Mohamed Ibrahim right now.
Thank you, Dr. Victor. And first of all, I would like to thank His Excellency's Minister and distinguished panelists and all protocol observed. First and foremost, I would like to congratulate the African Development Bank Group for releasing this first edition of African Macroeconomic Performance Outlook, which is very helpful for African governments and also researchers. And I'll go first to the key messages. Actually, in fact, the global economy is facing its most critical test since the Second World War. The COVID-19 pandemic and the climate change have taken a tremendous toll on people's lives, livelihoods, and growth prospects, and other on the past few years. The world is shocked, another by unprecedented shock with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in 2022. And in this world that plagued by multiple crises and difficult economic conditions, we should remain open to new innovative way to ensure our economic is resilient and sustainable. This will not be done unless we rely on projects and investments that will ensure that first, jobs are created within the economy, is thereby securing steady income flows for our respective population. Capital is a challenge through the economy to upgrade the infrastructure and ensure a green business climate. And the third is the private sector is fully engaged in the economy and leads the transition toward a more resilient economic setup. I think this brings us to Africa financing need to mitigate climate change and ensure just sustainable transition and most resilient green economy, which lead to eradicating poverty in the continent. And Africa needs for green transition is estimated to be around 130 billion USD to 170, around 3 to 9% of GDP on average. And actually, in this regard, COP27, which held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt last November, conclude with several important initiatives that were announced, among other conclusion and agreement. And actually, I want here to touch on Finance Day that has been organized by Arab Republic of Egypt Ministry of Finance. And actually, we was honored to initiate a couple of initiatives that was important to finance sustainability, which is the reducing the cost of green and sustainable borrowing and the sustainable debt collection. Well, in this light, MDBs have an important role to play. This initiative, developing countries should be able to mobilize external finances by way of availing more space for MDBs to use grants and ensure improving in their debt portfolio, resulting in a high credit rating and low cost of borrowing. And as a representative of Egypt Ministry of Finance, I want to point out that we are looking forward to engage with our counterparts from all African countries to work on this initiative for implementation for the good of our countries. Thank you very much, Dr. Victor. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim, and we do again appreciate you staying with us in spite of the technical hitches we did have earlier. We're going to come next to Fatima El Sheikh of Badia, the Arab Bank for Economic Development. Thank you for joining us. Your comments and outtake, key takeaways from the Performance Outlook report.
Thank you so much, Dr. Victor. And I think I'd start by actually congratulating the African Development Bank and Dr. Adesina and Professor Kevin and the African Union leadership for this organizing this event. I think it's a critical report because it comes with an African eye to an African issue. I think it's always important for us to have the dynamics of the African continent when you're looking at the policy decisions that are shaping the future of the economy of the continent and the growth, and that ultimately affects the people's life. So sincere congratulations to you, Ambassador Muchinga, and the African Union chairperson. I think the key token from the report is that Africa is still resilient. It's showing resilience above the expectation. Everybody was expecting that the COVID pandemic will hit Africa hard on all dynamics, on all the mortality, the morbidity, but Africa will manage to actually prove that it's resilient. It's also resilient by its policy decision, and that's where the difference comes in. I think it shows also, the report shows also a commitment from the African leadership in terms of the recovery and transformation. I think the countries are actually regaining trajectory in terms of recovery, but they're also regaining trajectory in terms of the transformation. So that's actually bringing the continent towards a different level. I think it also brings a very critical fact when it comes to the development finance gap in the continent. And I think that's where I would like to highlight, and that builds on the point raised by Professor Jeffrey. And I am one of your students through the UNDP lens in my previous career. So actually, I think it's critical that we still need financing in Africa and we should not shy away. We understand and we recognize the challenges that the continent have. And in fact, despite this challenging year, we are in the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa. We had the highest lending profile to ensure that there is a stability of the commodity. We actually grew our portfolio for 2022 by more than threefold, and mainly on the trade financing of a state-backed trade to ensure that the state have access to essential commodities despite the inflation. And that's where the policy decision of the countries reoriented themselves to improve their resilience, to ensure that they have enough surplus in their budget to make sure that they are able to tap on additional resources. We've also looked at areas where the policymakers were pushing us that we never explored, which is the direct budgetary support. So I think with that, there is a critical token to be realized. There is also a critical token that the year 2022 was the year of industrialization. And again, congratulations to the African Union for the Industrialization Summit. I think it brings in a strong light to what the African Union is pushing for. It's not only the mere fact of industrializing the minerals and the agriculture sector, but also the value addition industry. I'll quote a critical example of the cocoa, which is one of the major exports of Africa, but Africa gains very little in terms of the value addition of the cocoa itself. So I think that's where the industrialization push in the continent is very critical. And to spare you the time, Dr. Victor, there is actually a missing doctor in my title. It's actually that I would want to highlight 5 eyes for Africa that are eye-opener from the report itself. I think it's critical for Africa to continue to infuse the economic growth in the level of the household, something that we've done during the COVID time, where we made sure that there is a blanket cover for all the vulnerable and poor population so that they are not subjected to the macroeconomic fluctuation in the national economy. The second side is industrialization, and I've hammered that, and I'm sure that you've hammered it, and we will continue to hammer it until Africa managed to move from pre-industrial era to an era where we are at least able to compete with the fourth industrial revolution in the world. Innovation, and here I don't mean only innovation in technology and iTech, it's also innovation in financing, and that's a call for the African financing institutes also to look at the areas where we can innovate towards what is the perceived risk of Africa borrowing. And I think there is a huge antagonistic effect of the perceived risk for Africa that's actually not helping the private sector growth. And that brings me to my fourth eye, which is the investment. There is a critical need for enhancing the investment in the continent, where we are looking at private sector as a vector of growing the economies. We should not shy away from the fact that our private sector needs stimulus to grow, needs a stimulus to recover. And I think the countries has proven that they have stood very well with their SMEs. And we look at our books and we see that our profile for SME support to the 44 sub-Saharan African countries that we serve are actually growing. Finally, a critical one, inclusion. I think we cannot achieve anything when it comes to macroeconomic growth if we don't address the prevailing inclusion issues, the inequalities. And I'm very happy to have in the panel a very strong woman presence. And I thank the African Union for taking care of that and the African Development Bank. And I'll end up here. Thank you, Dr. Victor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fatima El Sheikh. Again, kindly forgive me there for that oversight. It was an oversight of the head and certainly not of the heart. Thank you for reminding us there, and again highlighting quite a number of essential areas here: the need for innovative financing, changing the optics on risk perceptions, private sector stimulus, and greater inclusiveness. Congratulations for growing Badia's portfolio during COVID, threefold. Excellent news there. Again, the result of improved economic policies in the countries in which you're doing business. Thank you once again. At this point, we're coming to the close of our session, but I'd like to give our panelists, and our panelists include 2 online panelists, as well as those of you who are still here. We've lost 2 panelists who had to go into another session, Dr. Yinka Oyelera and Dr. Beth Dunford. But I want to give our panelists who are online and with us right now an opportunity, 90 seconds to provide each to provide closing comments, after which we'll come to Dr. Akinwumi Adesina for his closing comments. I'm going to start with Dr. Mary Law. Akinwumi first, and then we'll work our way down.
I think what the report has shown, what of course the experiences that we have all shared here highlight that it is not a matter of if the next health crisis or the next conflict or the next a financial crisis will hit the continent. It's not a matter of if, it is rather when. And when this happens, we would like to be, of course, very well prepared. What we have seen over the past few months shows that the continent is resilient. We have to continue to build this resilience. And I think we have a strategy around continuing to invest in infrastructure, regional integration, improving the lives of the people of the continent, and feeding Africa, and which are really the high five that the bank has been
we're gonna stick to 90 seconds.
That's it.
Thank you very much. Again, great contributions. I just want to ensure that each of our panelists stick to time as we close. We're going to come next to Her Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed for her closing comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Victor. So for my 90 seconds, I want to start by saying we must mobilize private capital for development projects, and we must explore different sources of innovative financing models to attract this private capital. We must also continue to look at ways and means to add value to agricultural produce so that we can extract maximum value and retain value within our earnings, rather than just sending unprocessed products out of the country. We must also leverage on technology to build new schools, to give our large populations an opportunity to get into global labor force. Global services are now a great opportunity, especially for our youth. So we must be able to use the digital technology to reskill and retool our people. And we must work together as a continent to unlock long-term, low-cost financing. The Liquidity Sustainability Facility will help us to access capital markets, international capital markets, to get longer-term financing at low cost. And of course, again, there's what is left for me to say is to congratulate AFTB for this very, very good report that you have produced, and the recommendations are very useful to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed. We will come next to Dr. Fatima El Sheikh for her closing comments.
Thank you so much. I think I tried to merge the two, and you can give me, but I think I'll take this opportunity to hammer one critical point in terms of the interdependence between Africa and the rest of the world. The current relation is that we are dependent on the rest of the world. And I think we need to shift that, given the fact that we are able to use some of their commodities, but we are able to export to them. So there is an opportunity and a window where Africa can grow its export, especially in the era of lack of food products in the world and the current prevailing food insecurities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wrap up in 60 seconds. Greatly appreciated. And before we do our final introduction, I'd like to come last but certainly not the least to Professor Jeffrey Sachs for your closing comments.
Thank you. Just one closing thought, which is we should take really urgent efforts right now, I think, between the bank and the IMF to prevent any kind of downward spiral this year because of a debt crisis. Africa is not over indebted. It needs normal financing. So we should always be emphasizing the financing side, not the austerity side. And countries like Ghana right now, which are caught in the middle of this, need our help to make sure that they are properly financed programs, not a new round of so-called austerity, which makes no sense. We need investment-led growth. That means more financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Ladies and gentlemen, could you kindly give our panelists a warm round of applause? Her Excellency Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed, Dr. Marie-Laure Akinolugbade, Dr. Beth Dunford, Professor Oyebanji Oyeinka Oyelaran, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim, and Dr. Fatima El Sheikh. Thank you so much for your time and your invaluable contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly again acknowledge them with a warm Addis round of applause. Before we bring our program to a close, we do have another session coming up on sustainable development. And we do have with us Her Excellency Vera Davis de Souza, who is the Minister of Finance for Angola. She joins us here. Thank you very much again, Your Excellency, for coming in. At this time, we look forward to seeing you in our next session. And we encourage you to stay with us because we've got a lot of exciting stuff coming up in the next hour. At this point, I'd like to say once again, a big thank you to our distinguished panelists, our delegates, our speakers for your very insightful and, sorry? I'm coming to Dr. Adesina in a moment, don't worry about that. And your thought-provoking reflections and interventions. I'm Victor Oladipo. It really has been an honor moderating the presentation of the 2023 Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report here at the 36th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. Please join me in welcoming again Africa's Optimist-in-Chief, the President of the African Development Bank Group, to provide brief remarks and thanks, following which we'll have a short photograph session and break. At this point, over to you, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina.
Thank you very much, Victor. I would like to use this opportunity to really commend you for an excellent moderation that you have done. I'd like to thank His Excellency, the Commissioner Muchanga, for working with us to be able to have this session. I'd like to also thank very much the Minister of Finance of Zambia for ably representing His Excellency, President Hichilema of Zambia with your remarks. Thank you very much to you, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, for your very insightful comments, suggestions, and recommendations on how to have faster growth in Africa, and also what you said in terms of the volume of resources that are needed and the critical nature of actually upscaling the financing through the African Development Bank. Let me thank Minister Zainab Ahmed from Nigeria for sharing her experiences from Nigeria about what needs to be done in terms of also improving access of our countries to capital markets in these very, very tough times. And thank you to my Vice President Beth Dunford, Vice President Akin Olubade, but also to Professor Oyelaro and others that have contributed so significantly. Just to close with some of my thoughts on this. First is, I think I want to pick up on where Professor Jeffrey Sachs just left off. We must have a resolution of the debt issues in Africa. There are three fundamental areas there. We used to have, of course, we had the debt service suspension initiative. I think given the tightening of the fiscal space for our countries, there's certainly need for us to make sure that that actually gets further extended to give breathing room. Of course, we have from the Minister of Finance of Zambia about the G20 Common Framework. That's actually a great framework, because in getting the creditors all together to look at what needs to be done, both on the public side, but also on the private side. But we need to make faster progress on that. We have this for Ethiopia, we have it for Zambia, we have it for Chad. But as we heard from the Minister of Zambia, we need faster progress on that. We all need to work collectively on that. Of course, the critical issue we have to make sure we do is to make sure that low-income countries have access to much needed low-cost financing for their development. And we must also realize that if you take the Sahel, for example, take Niger, take Mali, take Chad, take Burkina Faso, many of these countries are spending so much of their resources on one issue that we have not talked about today, which is on security. And we just have to make sure that the development financing is going downwards, but expenditure on security continues to go up. So all the things that we are talking about today, we cannot achieve them unless we do a fundamental rethinking of the development paradigm itself. We have to now realize that insecurity or security, it's not an exogenous factor in the development process. Security is an endogenous factor, and therefore we must actively link together security with investment, with growth and development, and make sure that we come up with innovative tools to support many of these fiscally challenged countries that are facing insecurity to be able to get additional financing. We are leading a lot of work on this with security index investment bonds, to working together with the African Union Commission. And this is very important for us to bear in mind. I also think that we need to, I need to say that the progress that we are making at the African Development Bank in terms of taking the African Development Fund, which is the bank's facility for low-income countries to the market, it's a very, very significant one, because with that, we will be able to raise an additional $33 billion for these low-income countries. So again, making sure that we use the equity we have to leverage the capital markets will be a key part of leveraging more resources for these low-income countries. There's no doubt that we must also mobilize domestic resources. Yes, we have had that. We have to mobilize savings. We need to improve in tax collection and so on. But let's not forget, it's not just about collecting more taxes. It's about how the taxes are used. And I've always said that Africa has perhaps one of the highest implicit tax rates in the world, in the sense that we collect taxes, but governments do not do what they should do in most cases, to transfer most of this to the government, to the citizens. So the citizens have to provide electricity, they have to provide water, they have to provide their own insurance, they have to also make sure that they can send their kids to school. And so we have to make sure that expenditures, taxes that are collected are used effectively for the citizens. So there has to be issue of tax accountability, even as we talk about mobilizing more domestic resources. I want to also say I agree with what has been said about the issue of debt, but public financial management, we must continue to keep our eyes on that. Yes, we need more space for that, but I think I just want to add that we need also to look at the important debt. We can't develop only just on debt, though. We have to make sure that we open greater space for the private sector, especially on investment, which you all talked about. We ought to also develop a lot of local capital markets and focus more as well on mobilizing local currency financing to deal with some of the mismatch in terms of currency mismatch that you have. You have projects and infrastructure that are being done in local currency in terms of revenue, but also the loans you're taking are actually in foreign currency. And as Professor Rama said, as depreciation happens and the cost of financing those things go up. So we do need to prioritize and develop our local capital markets to mobilize a lot more local currency for financing infrastructure and other things. We've heard about the importance of illicit capital flows. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of governance. Let's make sure that we have better governance, cut back on illicit capital flows, and make sure that we put our monies in our continent, not outside the continent. The issue that I also want to say as we look at the importance of private investment, which Minister Ahmed just said, is the need for us to do two things. We have to de-risk, then we have to develop bankable projects. So we had the AU Commission Summit with NEPAD recently in Dakar, and we are working very closely with AU out of NEPAD on this particular issue. Let's make sure that we are focusing on quality infrastructure, de-risking this project, but developing quality projects that can be financed. Now, we should also focus on the issue of climate change. It's a big issue. We talked about it a bit tangentially, but this is going to be the biggest challenge that Africa faces. And we at the African Development Bank are doing our best with the African Adaptation Acceleration Program to mobilize $25 billion to support African countries to adapt to climate change, which is critical for us. And in closing, I just want to reemphasize what I said earlier. This is the time for us to work as a system to really optimize the global financial architecture. We need to optimize the balance sheets of the multilateral development banks. And Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you for the shout out for the African Development Bank. As I said, take the SDRs, for example. We can leverage those XDR by 3 to 4 times. And we are working very closely, Jeff, with Kristalina right now and our team with the Inter-American Development Bank on a model that we presented to them that they're looking at quite positively on how we can actually access these SDRs and then have this multiplicative effect to be able to deliver more for Africa. A $10 billion will become $30 to $40 billion. If a $20 billion can easily become $60 billion to $80 billion for Africa. So optimizing that global financial architecture, it's going to be very, very critical. IMF focusing on the global macroeconomic fiscal stability, us, the multilateral development banks, focusing on sectoral issues that many of you have talked about today. But also, our business model also needs to change. We clearly have a lot of resources that we need to accelerate our development. But we must therefore leverage the private sector. So when we talk about capital adequacy of the multilateral development banks, the critical issue is how you get risk capital, because it's the risk capital that you need to be able to leverage the private sector. So we should put attention to that. I am very pleased with the outcome of the Feed Africa Summit. In fact, Victor, as you were talking, I got new numbers coming in saying that we were able to mobilize $35.3 billion from so many partners from around the world in supporting Africa to fully unlock its agricultural potential. And I think, as Professor Rama said, if food accounts for almost 60%, 65% of consumer price index, so if we're able to feed ourselves, then we'll be able to drive inflation down significantly, because a lot of the inflation we have is actually structurally driven inflation. My last word is on industrialization. Professor Oyelaro said it. We must industrialize. The fastest way to poverty is the continued export of raw materials and commodities. But the highway to wealth is to industrialize. And so the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, as we talk about that throughout this summit, let's focus on making sure that the necessary infrastructure is there. The investment environment is good. Let's make sure that we are actually industrializing, having an industrial manufacturing zone that can create jobs, that have local and regional value chains that will make us more competitive in the global market. This is very, very critical. Let's create wealth for Africa. Let's grow faster. Let's grow better. Let's grow with more inclusivity, and let's be more competitive. As Jeffrey Carr said, Africa is going to be the center of the world, and we have all it takes to be what we say we want to be, the Africa we want. So thank you very, very much for your extensive contributions. Thank you very much for all your ideas. Let's work together and make Africa to be what we want it to be, the center for the world, not a follower in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akiomi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group. Thank you for those closing comments and for again synthesizing additional views and thoughts apart from your opening remarks. Very much appreciated. And thank you for being with us online as well as our other online panelists. Our next session will start a little bit late at 11:30. That's key actions to drive inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. That'll be at 11:30. Those online, you've already received links to that session. We'd like to let our panelists know that there will be a group photograph session outside the hall immediately following this event. I'd like to reserve the final round of applause to you, our participants and delegates, for taking out of your time to be with us here in Addis and also online, for patiently being a part of this very, very important session and report. Again, kindly give yourselves a warm round of applause. You very much deserve it. Once again, thank you very much. Have a wonderful morning.
Participants can also join the photograph.
All participants can also join in on the group photograph, which will be outside by the AU dais and flag. Thank you.
So colleagues, everyone, can we quickly go out and have the photograph? Thank you so much for coming.
Africa, a continent brimming with opportunities. Following 2 years of global shocks, African economies are defying domestic and global
Copies
shocks
of the report
and
are
returning the
available
continent
for
onto
you
a
to
path
collect.
of economic
Please.
recovery, stability and growth. The lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the ravages of climate change, and the impact of rising geopolitical conflicts and tension forced Africa's economies to slow down to 3.8% in 2022. In spite of a challenging global environment, the rays of a brighter 2023 and 2024 are on the horizon. Africa continues to demonstrate extraordinary resilience. African countries maintained a positive growth in 2022 and present a stable outlook for the next 2 years. To remain on this trajectory, Africa's economies will require comprehensive information and insights to navigate a labyrinth of intertwined global risks. This is why the African Development Bank Group published the inaugural 2023 Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report. This publication offers policymakers, global investors, researchers, and other development partners up-to-date, evidence-based assessments of the continent's recent macroeconomic performance. It also provides a short to medium-term outlook amid dynamic global economic developments. The report will be released in the first and third quarters of each year and complement the bank's flagship annual African Economic Outlook Report. This first edition of Africa's Macroeconomic